The wildest thing about Miss Urologist and her CEO patient is that it walks right up to you with a face like polished marble and says, "Yes, I'm a contract marriage rom-com," and then, without even blinking, slides a scalpel under the surface and starts talking about chronic poisoning, bodily autonomy, medical ethics, and the kind of loneliness you can't pay to outsource. I finished it with that slightly dazed feeling like I'd been laughing for hours, and then suddenly realized my throat was tight for a completely different reason. Welcome back to Flick Flair, by the way, where I apparently sign up to emotionally bond with fictional people who start their relationships with blackmail and end up teaching each other how to breathe again. If you like these long, dramatic deep dives, consider subscribing. I'm going moderate spoilers today, which basically means we're going to talk about the premise, the big emotional turns, the relationship mechanics, and some key revelations that are kind of impossible to discuss around. But I'm not going to do that thing where I itemize the final stretch like it's a police report. I want you to still have that wait, no way feeling when the show decides to swerve, because it does. Now, let's just say it out loud. The premise is ridiculous in the way only dramas can be ridiculous. Ximena is a urologist, competent, sharp, not here to be anyone's ornamental love interest, who needs research funding badly enough that she ends up blackmailing Aiden, an aloof CEO with the emotional availability of a locked safe. That blackmail pushes them into a contract marriage, and then the show does what it came here to do. It locks two proud people in a domestic space and watches sparks fly off their ego like flint. But the reason this one works when so many others collapse under the weight of their own gimmick is that it never lets you forget what's actually at stake. The money isn't just money. It's her work, her credibility, her ability to do something meaningful in a system that doesn't exactly hand a young woman a blank check and say, "Go change the world." And his coldness isn't just CEO syndrome. It's defensive architecture. It's a man living in a body that is betraying him and a life where every human interaction has a price tag attached. And if that sounds heavier than the title suggests, yeah, that's kind of the magic trick. The title sounds like it should be a goofy late-night click, something you huff-watch while folding laundry. Instead, it's this strange, addictive blend of screwball banter and quiet dread, like you're laughing in a hallway while a storm gathers behind the door at the end. What hooked me early wasn't even the blackmail. It was Ximena's vibe. She has this energy that reads like, "I'm exhausted, I'm underfunded, I've been underestimated in 12 different ways today, and I'm still the most competent person in this room." That's a hard character to write without making her either a saint or a caricature, and the show threads that needle by letting her be messy. She can be calculating, she can be petty, she can be morally flexible when cornered, but she is never written as stupid. And that's such a relief I could have kissed the screen. And then there's Aiden, who could have easily been another cardboard cutout of a man in a suit saying interesting while staring into the middle distance. Instead, he's played like a person who has trained himself not to react. You know those performances where the actor barely moves their face, but you can see the thought happening anyway, like weather behind glass? That's him. His whole thing is control. Control of image, control of narrative, control of space. So the moment Ximena gets leverage over him, it isn't just inconvenient, it's humiliating. And humiliation is where his feelings start leaking out, whether he wants them to or not. Stick with me, because the tone of their early dynamic is doing more work than it seems. The early episodes, or early stretch, however you want to frame it, operate like a chess match dressed up as domestic comedy. The contract marriage setup is the board. Their pride is the timer. Their attraction is the part neither of them wants to admit is even in the room. You get these scenes where they're negotiating terms like hostile business partners, but the camera is catching the micropauses, the half-swallowed reactions, the way their eyes keep flicking to each other like they're checking for cracks. And I loved how the show uses the living together premise not just for "oops, we share a towel" antics, but to show how different their default worlds are. He moves like everything belongs to him, even when he's trying not to. She moves like someone who has had to earn every inch of space she takes up. When they collide in a kitchen or a hallway, it's not just physical blocking, it's power. There's a specific kind of humor this drama leans into that I'm a sucker for, the humor of competence. Ximena isn't funny because she's clumsy or naive. She's funny because she's quick, because she sees through him, because she refuses to be intimidated by his wealth-coded stiffness. And Aiden isn't funny because he's a clown. He's funny because he's so tightly wound that any deviation from his plan becomes comedy by sheer contrast. The best moments are when his CEO mask slips for half a second, and you can tell he's as surprised as we are that he's reacting. And the show's directing understands that comedy lives in timing and denial. It holds on faces just long enough for you to catch the second thought. It lets silences land like punchlines. It uses the house, this shared space, as a pressure cooker. You'll see them in the same frame but separated by furniture, by doorways, by literal distance that feels like emotional distance. And then, gradually, the frames tighten. They start sharing the same air. Now, I'm going to talk about the impotence angle because it's not just a shock detail, it's thematically central. And it's also where this show could have face-planted into cheapness if it wasn't careful. The word impotence is used in a way that, in lesser hands, would become a constant punchline or a simplistic symbol of broken man needs love. But Miss Urologist and her CEO patient does something smarter. It treats it as a medical problem with emotional consequences, not as a moral failing. It's not about masculinity as a joke. It's about the terror of losing agency over your own body. And then we get that shift. Ximena discovers that his impotence is linked to chronic poisoning. That detail changes the genre temperature instantly. Suddenly, the romance isn't floating in a bubble. There's danger. There's conspiracy energy. There's a question sitting at the center of the relationship that isn't romantic at all. Who would do this? And why has he been alone with it for so long? This is where I started respecting the show on a craft level. Because it could have treated the poisoning as a twist you mentioned once, and then forget why the couple plays house. Instead, it becomes a tether that keeps pulling them back to reality. The fake marriage stops being just a trope engine and starts being cover, protection, proximity. Ximena's dedication to treating him becomes the real intimacy, the kind that's earned by showing up when it's inconvenient. And yes, I know, if you're side-eyeing the blackmail to caregiver pipeline, you're not alone. I was watching like, girl, ethically, are we okay? But that discomfort is actually part of why the story has bite. Ximena doesn't get to be the morally pure heroine who never crosses a line. She crosses it. Then she has to live in the aftermath of that choice, in the house with the man she cornered, and gradually realize he's not just a walking bank account with cheekbones. The show is also quietly doing something about institutions, about what it takes to fund research, about who gets believed, about who gets to have ambition without being called ruthless. Ximena's blackmail isn't framed as cute. It's framed as desperate, strategic, and, honestly, kind of ugly in the way real desperation can be. That makes the later softness feel earned rather than automatic. Let me paint you one of the scenes as I experienced it, because there's a moment that encapsulates the whole vibe. It's not about a big confession or a dramatic kiss. It's about a room and a silence. They're in close proximity, some domestic setting where the air feels too still, like the house itself is listening. Aiden is doing that thing where he's pretending to be fine, posture perfect, voice controlled. Ximena is watching him the way doctors watch patients when they already know the patient is lying because the body is telling the truth. And you can feel the second where she chooses not to tease him. She chooses not to win. She softens her voice just a fraction, and it's like the temperature drops. The camera doesn't rush. It lingers on his eyes, the smallest flicker of panic and relief fighting for space. And you realize this is intimacy, not romance novel intimacy, medical intimacy, the kind that scares people more than sex ever could. That's the emotional engine, and it's why I got attached. Here's the other thing that surprised me. The show doesn't rush the he falls for her part in a lazy way. Aiden starts from a place of wanting to use her, because that's how he understands relationships. Transactional, efficient, controlled. So watching him gradually lose control is the point. You see him start to care in ways he can't justify to himself. He'll do something protective and then immediately try to reframe it as practical. He'll show up, then pretend it's coincidence. He'll listen, then act like he was just gathering data. It's pathetic. It's adorable. It's painfully human. And Ximena, to her credit, doesn't just melt because a rich man looked at her with puppy eyes. She's not easily won. She's not written as someone who forgets the power imbalance. She's constantly calibrating. Is this man safe emotionally? Is he sincere? Is he using me? And even when she starts caring, she's still herself. That's rare. Usually in these dramas, the heroine's personality gets sanded down once the romance kicks in. Here, her of wits leans a little too far into sitcom rhythm, where you can feel the writers setting up a comedic reversal rather than letting the situation breathe naturally. And occasionally the CEO world feels like an abstract concept. He's powerful because the script says so, instead of a textured environment. But even when it stumbles forward with personality. And I'll take that over a perfectly polished nothing burger any day. Let's talk about the chemistry. Because you can have the smartest script in the world, and if the leads don't spark, you're dead in the water. What I loved about their chemistry is that it isn't just sexual tension. It's intellectual irritation. It's the feeling of being seen by someone you didn't invite into your inner world. Ximena doesn't just find him attractive. She finds him suspicious. Aiden doesn't just want her. He can't predict her. And for a man like him, unpredictability is basically foreplay. Their banter has a crispness to it, and it's helped by the editing. The show knows when to cut quickly for comedy and when to hold for discomfort. A lot of the laughs come from reaction shots, Aiden's controlled facade cracking, Ximena's little, "Are you serious right now?" stare that could peel paint. And the sound design is subtle but effective. The quiet in the house when tension rises, the slightly brighter musical cues when their rivalry flips into flirtation, the way certain scenes let ambient sound do the emotional work instead of drowning everything in strings. And can we just pause on the fact that the drama is about urology and somehow manages to be elegant? I don't know how else to say it. I went in expecting awkwardness, maybe cheap jokes. Instead, it treats the medical side with a surprising amount of respect. It's not turning the body into a gag. It's letting the body be part of the story, which is oddly refreshing in a genre that often treats illness as either a tragic ornament or a convenient plot lever. Now, the poisoning thread. This is where the show's mood deepens, and where the visuals start to matter more. The lighting choices shift depending on whether we are in domestic sparring mode or something is very wrong mode. The domestic scenes tend to have warmth, soft light, a sense of everyday life slowly building. The more sinister or medically tense moments lean cooler, sharper, with shadows that feel like they're hiding answers. It's not flashy cinematography, but it's intentional. It's emotional color grading, basically. And because the poisoning is chronic, not a sudden dramatic collapse, the tension is more insidious. There's no easy villain of the week energy. It's this lingering threat that makes Aiden's control obsession make sense. If you're being harmed slowly, without knowing exactly how, you would clamp down on everything you can control. Your schedule, your image, your relationships, your feelings. So when Ximena enters his life like a bright, argumentative meteor, she's not just annoying, she's destabilizing. She's a variable. And she's also a mirror. Ximena has her own version of control. Hers is competence. She's the kind of person who thinks if she just works hard enough, if she just gathers enough data, if she just stays sharp, she can outpace the chaos. So watching her face something that isn't purely scientific, that involves trust, vulnerability, emotional risk is part of her arc too. She can treat poisoning. But can she treat a person who has learned to distrust care? There a moment in the middle stretch where the fake relationship starts doing that thing fake relationships always do in dramas. It becomes real in tiny, humiliating increments. It's not one grand turning point. It's a series of small betrayals of their own rules. Ximena starts paying attention to him when she doesn't have to. Aiden starts noticing her moods, her fatigue, her stress, and you can see him trying to file it away as irrelevant and failing. The contract might still be the official story, but their bodies are already writing a different one. And I want to say something slightly contrarian, because I've already seen how people tend to talk about these setups. The obvious reading is, she blackmails him, he uses her, they both learn to love, yay. But I actually think the more interesting reading is that Ximena is the one with the real power from the start. Not because she has leverage, but because she's the only person in his life who interacts with him as a human body instead of a human brand. Everyone else treats Aiden like a title. Ximena treats him like a patient. And that is both threatening and liberating. That's why he can't simply buy her loyalty in the way he's used to buying solutions. Her loyalty, when it starts to form, is rooted in principle and care. She's not impressed by his wealth. She's impressed by his capacity to endure. And she's furious that someone is harming him. That fury is such a key flavor in the romance. It's not just softness. It's righteous anger on behalf of someone who doesn't know how to ask for help. Stay with me, because the show's humor actually becomes sharper once the feelings get messier. The battle of wits and laughter part of the premise isn't just them trading zingers. It's two people trying to protect themselves by performing versions of themselves. Ximena performs ruthless ambition because it's safer than admitting she's scared her work will fail. Aiden performs indifference because it's safer than admitting he's terrified. So their comedy is basically armor clanking together. There are scenes where you can feel them circling each other verbally like they're fencing with language. A line lands, a pause, a glance. Someone smirks just to prove they're not affected. Someone changes the subject because the previous one got too close to the bone. And the actors sell this with micro-expressions that reward you for paying attention. Ximena's face will soften for a beat before she catches herself. Aiden's jaw will tighten in that way that says, do not feel feelings right now, and then he'll feel them anyway. And the show's editing knows to let those beats live. It doesn't always cut away to a comedic sting. Sometimes it just sits there and lets the discomfort simmer. That's where the intimacy grows, in the moments the characters can't talk their way out of. I also want to give credit to the way the drama uses the contract marriage trope as a social performance. They're not just living together, they're presenting as a couple. That performance forces them into proximity in public and in private, and it creates this delicious tension where they're acting affectionate in front of others, and then, the second the door closes, they're like, don't touch me, except their bodies have already memorized the warmth. And yes, that's where you get the funniest moments too. The we have to look convincing situations are inherently comedic. But what makes them land is that the comedy is rooted in character. Ximena's idea of convincing is blunt and practical. Aiden's idea of convincing is controlled and curated. Watching them try to synchronize those approaches is like watching two people attempt a duet while insisting they don't even like music. At some point, I realized the show had made me care about their domestic routines. Not the big romantic gestures, the small stuff. Who wakes up first? Who makes the coffee? Who pretends not to notice the other person's bad day? That's when I knew I was cooked, emotionally. Because once a drama gets you invested in the vibe of a kitchen, you're done. It owns you. And here's my personal confession. Because I wasn't expecting this drama to hit me in this specific place. I have a complicated relationship with medical storylines. I'm the kind of person who hears the word chronic attached to anything, and my brain immediately starts spinning into that quiet anxiety spiral of, what if you can't fix it? What if it's just forever? So watching Aiden's condition framed not as a punchline, But as this ongoing threat, this thing he's had to compartmentalize genuinely got under my skin. There were moments where his controlled exterior felt less like a trope and more like something I've seen in real people who are just trying to get through the day without falling apart. And that made Zimena's dedication land harder. Because the fantasy isn't just a rich CEO falls for a doctor. The fantasy is someone stays. Someone believes you. Someone fights for your body like it's worth fighting for even when you've started to detach from it. Now, I do want to talk about how the show handles gender dynamics because this is where it could have easily fallen into tired patterns. A lot of CEO romances treat the female lead as a moral accessory. She's there to teach him to be human, and her career becomes a decorative detail. Miss Urologist and her CEO patient refuses to fully do that. Zimena's career isn't a cute quirk. It's the axis of her identity. The research funding isn't just an excuse for plot. It's her purpose. And that creates a more interesting romantic conflict than usual, because it means she can't simply be absorbed into his world. In fact, her whole arc is about refusing to be absorbed. She's not trying to become Mrs. CEO. She's trying to become a doctor who can actually do the work she believes in. The romance has to fit around that, not replace it. Aiden, meanwhile, has to confront the fact that he can't control her with money or status. And I love that the show doesn't make him instantly enlightened. He tries. He tests boundaries. He frames things as business. He defaults to manipulation because that's what he knows. And watching those tactics fail is satisfying in a way that feels like the show is gently dragging him toward growth rather than handing it to him as a reward for being handsome. There's also something quietly radical about a drama that lets a female doctor be the pursuer of a medical truth while the male lead is physically vulnerable. Not in a he's weak, she's strong, simplistic way, but in a way that flips the usual gaze. Aiden is often the one being observed, assessed, treated, and he hates it. He hates being seen in that way, which, again, makes sense. Powerful men are used to being looked at with admiration or fear, not clinical clarity. And Zimena's clinical clarity is kind of a superpower. She can look at him and say, without drama, something is wrong. She can name what others tiptoe around. That's why their relationship has this friction that feels real. She is not easily seduced by his performance because her job is literally to see past performance to reality. Let's linger on the performances for a second, because even though I'm not naming actor names here, the choices matter. Zimena is played with this balance of toughness and warmth that doesn't feel like a toggle switch. It feels like layers. When she's in doctor mode, her voice steadies. Her eyes sharpen. When she's in person mode, you see the exhaustion in her shoulders, the way she exhales like she's been holding her breath all day. And when she's caught off guard by affection, when Aiden does something unexpectedly gentle, you can see her recalibrating in real time. That's the stuff that makes a romance feel lived in. Aiden's performance is all about restraint. The actor understands that a man like this doesn't cry easily, doesn't confess easily, doesn't even laugh easily. So when he does laugh, it hits like a crack in ice. When he looks at her for a second too long, it reads like he's losing a battle inside himself. And because the show doesn't overuse those moments, they stay potent. The directing helps by not constantly underlining the romance with music. Sometimes it lets you sit in the awkwardness. Sometimes it uses music sparingly, like a pulse, not a command. And that restraint makes the emotional spikes feel sharper. Okay, we need to talk about the ethics again, because if I'm being honest, that's where some viewers are going to bounce off. Zimena blackmailing him for research funds is, on paper, not defensible. And the show doesn't fully sanitize it. What it does instead is contextualize it. It shows you a world where the systems that should fund meaningful work don't, where ambition is punished unless it's backed by the right connections, where doing the right thing often means losing. Does that excuse blackmail? No. But it makes it legible. And the drama's emotional journey depends on Zimena recognizing the humanity of the man she initially treated as a resource. If she started off morally perfect, there would be nowhere for her to go. The discomfort is the point. And I know some people will be like, why should I root for her then? And I get it. But I'll be real. I've always preferred messy heroines with conviction over perfect heroines with no edges. Ximena's flaw is not cruelty, it's tunnel vision. She believes the end will justify the means because she's convinced the end is worth it. Watching that belief get challenged by proximity to Aiden's vulnerability is where the story gains emotional complexity. Plus, the show never forgets that Aiden isn't an innocent lamb either. He's not just a victim. He's someone who, at least initially, is willing to use her right back. The relationship begins in mutual manipulation. That's why it's a battle of wits, not a one-sided coercion fantasy. They're both trying to win. The romance is them realizing winning feels hollow if it costs them the one person who actually sees them. And if that sounds intense, don't worry. The drama still knows how to have fun. There's a playfulness in the way it stages their domestic clashes. The blocking often puts them in each other's space in ways that are annoying before they're romantic. Like, someone is always turning around and almost bumping into the other, or reaching for something at the same time, or speaking too close because they're both too stubborn to step back. It's physical comedy without becoming slapstick. Also, can we talk about the title again? Miss Urologist and her CEO patient. It sounds like something your aunt would forward you with 14 exclamation points. And yet, it's oddly fitting because it frames the relationship in the exact terms the characters are trying to escape. Doctor, patient, professional boundary, power imbalance. That's the box they start in. The story is them slowly, painfully, sweetly climbing out of it. And the show keeps teasing you with the question, when does a patient stop being a patient in the context of a relationship? When does a doctor stop being a doctor? Can they ever? Or will that dynamic always haunt the romance? That's not a small question. And the drama doesn't answer it with a neat slogan. It explores it through discomfort. Through Ximena's fierce professionalism and Aiden's reluctant dependence. Through moments where she has to decide whether to treat him clinically or comfort him as a partner. Through moments where he has to decide whether to let her in or keep hiding behind pride. And that's where the poisoning plot becomes more than a thriller garnish. It forces the issue. It forces intimacy to be earned in a way that's not just about attraction. There's a particular kind of tension that builds when a character's body is telling the truth while their mouth lies. Aiden keeps trying to operate like a machine. He wants to treat his condition like a problem to be managed privately, quietly, without vulnerability. But chronic poisoning isn't polite. It doesn't care about his brand. It doesn't care about his schedule. It will demand attention. And Ximena is the one person trained to listen to what the body is saying. So even when he resists her, the narrative keeps pulling them together through necessity. And necessity is such an underrated romance ingredient. Everyone talks about destiny, soulmates, fate. This show is like, what about the unglamorous reality of showing up to appointments, adjusting treatment, paying attention to symptoms, making choices you don't want to make? It makes care sexy in a way that isn't performative. That's rare. Let me throw in a lighter aside before we go deeper, because my brain needs it. I did not expect to spend my 2026 viewing hours thinking, wow, urology is really carrying the emotional arc right now. Like, if you told me last year that I'd be sitting here earnestly discussing urinary tract medicine as Roman subtext, I would have asked what kind of cursed algorithm you live under. And yet, here we are. Life is beautiful and humiliating. Now, the show's pacing. This is where you can tell it's made by people who understand that romantic tension is a resource. If you spend it all too early, you're left with nothing but misunderstandings. Miss Urologist and her CEO patient spends it carefully. It gives you enough to stay hungry, little moments of tenderness, glimpses of jealousy, flashes of protectiveness. But it keeps the characters emotionally honest in their denial for a while. There's also a nice balance between plot propulsion and relationship development. The poisoning thread gives the story an external engine. Ximena's research funding goal gives it a professional engine. The contract marriage gives it a social engine. And then the romance is the emotional engine tying them together. When one engine slows, another kicks in. That's why it stays watchable. Visually, the show knows how to glamorize without becoming sterile. CEO spaces can look like empty museums if you're not careful. Medical spaces can look like fluorescent nightmares. This drama finds a middle ground. The CEO world is sleek, but not lifeless. The medical world is clinical, but not cold. And when those worlds collide, when Ximena's practical, work-worn energy moves through his curated environment, you get this visual metaphor for the relationship itself. The color palette tends to play in contrasts too. You'll get warm domestic tones when they're accidentally sinking, cooler tones when secrets or threats creep in. It's not subtle, but it's effective. And the camera often frames Aiden in ways that emphasize isolation, alone in big spaces, centered but distant, while Ximena is framed in motion, in cluttered environments, surrounded by the mess of real life. When she starts inhabiting his spaces, the frames change. They feel less empty. Again, not groundbreaking cinematography, but emotionally literate. And editing-wise, I appreciated that the show doesn't overcut the banter. Some rom-coms chop dialogue into tiny pieces to manufacture energy. Here, the actors are allowed to play. You get full beats. You get overlap. You get the sense that these people are actually responding, not just delivering lines. Okay, but what about the romance itself? What is it actually saying? To me, the core romance fantasy isn't wealth. Aiden being a CEO is almost incidental except as a symbol of control and power. The real fantasy is transformation without erasure. Ximena doesn't have to become softer to be loved. Aiden doesn't have to become louder to be understood. They change, but they don't become different people. They become fuller versions of themselves. Ximena learns that care isn't just something you give professionally. It's something you can allow yourself to receive. Aiden learns that control isn't the same as safety, and that letting someone see you doesn't automatically mean they'll use it against you. That's the emotional bargain they keep inching toward. And the show uses the fake marriage as an emotional laboratory. They're forced to play at intimacy, and in doing so, they discover what intimacy actually requires. Attention, patience, humility, the willingness to be wrong, the courage to not always win. It's also, quietly, about consent. Not just sexual consent, though that's obviously part of any romance worth respecting, but consent in a broader sense. Consent to be treated. Consent to be cared for. Consent to be known. Aiden's entire arc is learning how to consent to vulnerability rather than being forced into it by circumstance. Ximena's arc is learning how to ask rather than assume, even when she thinks she knows best. Now, because I'm doing moderate spoilers, I'm not going to get too deep into the later stage emotional payoffs. But I will say the drama earns its sweetness by putting the characters through enough discomfort that when softness finally arrives, it feels like a choice, not a default. And this is where I want to highlight one of my favorite structural decisions. The show doesn't treat falling in love as the solution to the poisoning. It treats love as a reason to fight harder, not as the cure itself. Ximena's medical dedication remains medical. Aiden's recovery, to the extent that the story frames it, remains tied to actual treatment and truth-seeking. The romance doesn't magically heal the body. It heals the isolation around the body. That's a meaningful distinction. There's a scene energy that keeps recurring, and it's basically the show's signature, Ximena working, focused, stubborn, refusing to give up, while Aiden watches her with this expression that is half disbelief, half hunger, half fear. Fear because he wants to trust her, and trusting her would mean admitting he needs her. Hunger because he's never been looked at with that kind of unglamorous devotion. Disbelief because who does that for him without charging interest? And every time the show returns to that dynamic, It deepens it a little. It's repetition with evolution. The first time, it's suspicion. The next time, it's reluctant reliance. Then it's protectiveness. Then it's something like tenderness. But he'll die before he calls it that out loud. If you're wondering why I'm spending so much time on emotional microshifts, it's because that's where this drama lives. The plot is fun, sure. But the reason it sticks is the slow, stubborn way it builds trust. Now, I've seen some people dismiss this kind of story as just another fake marriage rom-com, and I get the fatigue. The trope is everywhere. But what Miss Urologist and her CEO patient does differently is it gives the leads real, specific reasons for their behavior that aren't just genre excuses. Ximena's desperation is tied to her work. Aiden's coldness is tied to his body and his environment. Their manipulation is rooted in survival strategies. That makes the romance feel less like two pretty people trapped in a trope machine, and more like two damaged systems colliding and slowly recalibrating. And the humor helps. God, the humor helps. Because without it, the poisoning thread and the ethical mess could make the show heavy. The comedy is the oxygen. It's what makes the serious moments hit harder, because the audience isn't numb. You're allowed to laugh. So when the drama turns, you feel it. There's a particular kind of laugh the show gets out of me. The laugh of recognition. The laugh you do when someone says something petty but true, when someone refuses to be impressed by wealth, when someone calls out a power play with a raised eyebrow. Ximena's bluntness is often the comedic blade that slices through Aiden's polished nonsense. And his reactions, those controlled, offended little pauses, are comedy gold. But the show is careful not to make him just a punching bag. It gives him dignity. It gives him pain. It lets him be right sometimes. It lets Ximena be wrong sometimes. That balance is crucial, because romance built on one person constantly humiliating the other stops being romantic and starts being mean. And this is where the battle of wits framing matters. It's a battle, but it's also play. It's flirtation disguised as conflict. And the show knows how to stage that physically. They'll stand too close. They'll invade each other's personal space under the guise of argument. They'll speak in low voices that are technically hostile, but emotionally intimate. It's that delicious contradiction romance writers live for. Let's pivot to theme for a second, because the poisoning plot invites a deeper reading about trust and institutions. Chronic poisoning implies an ongoing betrayal. It implies that something in Aiden's environment, something close, something routine, has been harming him over time. That's not just a thriller hook. It's a metaphor for the kind of life he's lived. Successful on paper, slowly eroded by unseen threats, surrounded by people who may not be safe. So when Ximena enters and starts insisting on truth, she isn't just helping him physically. She's disrupting the ecosystem of his life. She's making it harder for lies to survive. And that's dangerous. Not because she's reckless, but because truth is destabilizing in a world built on image control. And again, the show doesn't need to name every threat explicitly for that tension to work. You feel it in the way Aiden moves. You feel it in the way he hesitates before accepting help. You feel it in the way he tests Ximena, pushes her away, then pulls her back, like he's trying to confirm whether she's real or just another performance. Ximena, meanwhile, is fighting a different kind of poison, the slow toxicity of being undervalued. The system that makes her hustle for research funds, that makes her consider morally questionable choices just to keep her work alive. So both leads are, in their own ways, being eroded by forces around them. The romance is them becoming antidotes for each other, not by being perfect, but by being present. If you're still with me, good, because I want to talk about the domestic intimacy and why it's the true star of the show. Domestic intimacy is hard to write because it's not flashy. It's not a kiss in the rain. It's a cup placed in the right spot without asking. It's a door held open. It's someone noticing you didn't eat. It's someone remembering your schedule. It's the little negotiations of shared space. And this drama understands that the contract marriage trope is basically an excuse to show domesticity as romance. You start noticing how they navigate the house. Early on, it's territorial. They keep to their zones. They use formal language. They maintain distance like it's law. Then slowly, without announcement, the house becomes shared. They start leaving things out. They start anticipating each other. The camera catches these changes quietly, like it's documenting wildlife. And the best part is, neither of them wants to admit it's happening. Which means you, the viewer, get to sit there like a smug little goblin going, "Oh, you care." It's delightful. There's also an undercurrent of grief in Aiden's arc that the show touches in a subtle way. It's grief for his own body, grief for the version of himself he thought he was, grief for the illusion of invincibility. Men like him are taught they should be immune to fragility. So when fragility arrives, it feels like failure. The drama doesn't turn that into melodrama. It turns it into quiet moments where he stares a little too long into nothing, where his voice tightens, where he withdraws. And Ximena's response to that withdrawal is where the romance becomes surprisingly mature. She doesn't chase him in a needy way. She doesn't demand emotional access like she's entitled to it. She approaches him like a skittish animal sometimes, slow, patient, offering care without forcing it. And when she does push, it's often because she's scared for his health, not because she wants reassurance. That distinction matters. It makes their bond feel grounded in something more than ego. Now, I want to acknowledge that the show is still a romance drama, and it does indulge in fantasy. The idea that a CEO would agree to a contract marriage under blackmail, the idea that this arrangement could be maintained without imploding instantly, the idea that two people that stubborn could cohabitate without the house catching fire, these are genre fantasies. But the show's emotional realism makes the fantasy palatable, and it's also aware of itself. There's a lightness in the way it sometimes plays the absurdity, like it knows you know this is heightened, and it's inviting you to enjoy the ride rather than interrogate every logistical detail. That's a tone balance some dramas fail at. They either take themselves too seriously and become unintentionally funny, or they become so self-parodying that you can't invest emotionally. This one walks the line. I'll say, too, that the show's title character being a urologist is not a random gimmick. Urology is literally about private vulnerability. It's about the parts of the body people are embarrassed to talk about. It's about functions people associate with pride, sexuality, control. So making the heroine a urologist is thematically perfect for a story about a powerful man forced to confront vulnerability and a woman forced to navigate power dynamics. It's almost poetic in a very unglamorous way, which is my favorite kind of poetic, honestly. Give me meaning with a little dirt under its nails. There's a sequence vibe, again, speaking generally, that the show uses when Ximena is in full doctor-investigator mode. The music tightens. The cuts become a little sharper. The lighting cools. And you feel the genre shift toward medical mystery. Those sequences are crucial because they remind you Ximena has a purpose beyond romance. She's not just there to banter with Aiden. She's there to solve something, to heal something, to fight something. And those moments also complicate her feelings, because the more she learns about his condition, the more she sees how alone he's been. And that loneliness becomes personal. Not in a savior complex way, but in a human way. Like, you shouldn't have had to endure this by yourself. That's where affection starts germinating. Aiden's response to her dedication is also layered. At first, he's suspicious. He thinks everyone wants something. Then he's irritated because her care doesn't fit his model of control. Then, slowly, he becomes dependent in small ways, and that dependence scares him. You can see him trying to regain control by reframing the relationship as transactional. I'm using you. This is convenient. This is a deal. But the more he insists it's just business, the more obvious it becomes that business has never looked like this. And that's where the drama's emotional irony shines. The thing he wants most, someone who cares without a price, is the thing he can't accept without feeling weak. The thing she wants most, resources to do meaningful work, is the thing she can't accept without feeling compromised. So both of them are trapped between desire and dignity. The romance is them learning that dignity doesn't have to mean isolation. If you're sensing a pattern, yes, this is a story about pride. Pride as armor. Pride as prison. And the show is surprisingly good at making pride feel sexy and sad at the same time. You'll have scenes where they're arguing and you're smiling because the banter is sharp, and then a line lands a little too close to the truth, and suddenly you're like, oh, that's a wound. The show likes to sneak emotional knives into comedic exchanges. It's very good at that. One of the things I appreciated is that Ximena isn't written as endlessly patient. She gets frustrated. She snaps. She calls him out. She refuses to coddle him. And that's important because it prevents the doctor-patient dynamic from becoming paternalistic in reverse. She's not his caretaker in a one-way sense. She's his equal, even when she's treating him. She demands respect. She demands honesty. She demands that he stop using his coldness as a shield. And when he does open up, when he gives her even a sliver of real vulnerability, it feels like a gift, not a genre obligation. That's a sign the show did its job. Now, a lot of viewers will come into this expecting the romance to be the main dish, and it is. But I think the hidden dish is Ximena's ambition. The drama keeps returning to her research funding goal. And it's not just a plot excuse. It's her heart. It's her belief that she can push medicine forward, that she can do something that matters. That's why she's willing to be ruthless. That's why she's willing to be hated. She's not chasing romance, she's chasing impact. And that made me respect her even when I disagreed with her choices. Because she's not motivated by vanity. She's motivated by purpose. Aiden, on the other hand, is a man who has achieved what society calls success and yet is spiritually starving. That's a common trope, sure, but the poisoning adds a literal dimension to the metaphor. He is being consumed from within. His world is sick. And Ximena is an outsider who can diagnose sickness. So their romance becomes a collision between a woman trying to build something new and a man realizing his empire might be built on rot. That's heavy. And yet the show still finds time to make you laugh at them bickering over the dumbest domestic things. That tonal agility is honestly impressive. I also want to say something about how the show handles using each other, because that's one of its central tensions. Aiden initially wants to use Ximena. Ximena initially uses Aiden. The difference is, Ximena's use is tied to a broader good, research funding, while Aiden's use is more personal, more about control and convenience. But both are still forms of instrumentalizing another person. What the drama does well is show that instrumentalizing someone doesn't mean you can't also genuinely care about them. People are messy. Motives are mixed. You can start with selfishness and still stumble into sincerity. The story is not pretending their beginning is pure. It's showing how love can grow in compromised soil. And if that makes you uncomfortable, good. It should. The drama isn't asking you to cheer for blackmail. It's asking you to watch two people reckon with what they did to each other and choose to become better anyway. There's a point where the fake relationship becomes real, energy starts building. And what I loved is that it doesn't arrive with a single trumpet blast. It arrives with exhaustion, with tenderness sneaking in while they're too tired to perform, with them forgetting to keep score, with them doing things that aren't strategic anymore. And that's where the show's quietest moments become the most romantic. Not kisses, not confessions, moments where they sit in the same space and silence is no longer hostile. Moments where they share a look that says, "You're here." Moments where Aiden lets himself be cared for without making a joke or a demand. I know I'm circling around specifics, and that's partly because of the spoiler level. But it's also because the show's power is less about what happens and more about how it feels. It feels like watching two people slowly dismantle their own defenses, one brick at a time, while pretending they're just redecorating. And can I just say, the drama understands the appeal of a competent woman and a vulnerable, powerful man. That dynamic is catnip when done respectfully. Ximena doesn't infantilize him. She doesn't mock his condition. She treats him seriously. And Aiden, over time, stops treating her like a tool and starts treating her like a person with agency. That evolution is the romance. Now, I do think the show occasionally leans too hard into the CEO aloofness aesthetic, where Aiden's emotional repression becomes almost stylized. There are moments where I wanted just a hair more mess from him earlier, a crack in the armor sooner, because the withholding can sometimes feel like the script delaying gratification rather than the character being psychologically consistent. But when the cracks do come, they're satisfying. And maybe that's the trade-off. You wait, and then you get hit. Also, the drama's depiction of research funding desperation could have been even more grounded. Sometimes it feels like money solves everything is a little too convenient as a narrative lever, even though in real life money absolutely does determine what research gets done. I just wanted a bit more texture around her professional world, more sense of the obstacles beyond needs funds. But given the genre, I understand why the story stays focused on the central duo. And speaking of central duo, their romance is sold not just by dialogue, but by physicality. The way they stand, the way they hesitate before touching, the way their bodies react before their mouths catch up. There's a scene flavor where Ximena will reach for him in a purely clinical way, checking something, adjusting something, and Aiden will freeze because his body interprets touch as intimacy even when his brain insists it's medical. That tension is so specific and it's used well. It also raises a question the show keeps poking. What counts as intimacy? Is it sex? Is it touch? Is it care? Is it someone learning your symptoms better than you do? Is it someone noticing when you're lying? The drama's answer seems to be, intimacy is attention. Sustained attention. The kind that costs time. And that's why the romance feels unexpectedly tender. If you're the kind of viewer who needs high heat, you might find the slow burn frustrating in places. But if you like emotional layering, you'll eat. Because every time you think the show is about to give you a straightforward romantic beat, it complicates it with pride, fear, or ethics. And that's where the sweet and unexpected romance part becomes earned. Unexpected not because it's shocking that two attractive leads fall in love, obviously they will, but because it's unexpected that a relationship born out of manipulation can become something that feels, by the end, genuinely respectful. I'm not saying the show turns blackmail into a fairy tale. I'm saying it turns blackmail into a starting point for character growth rather than a cute quirk. That's a big difference. Now, one more craft thing I want to highlight. The show's use of laughter as a coping mechanism. The premise literally says battle of wits and laughter. And that's not just marketing. Both characters use humor as deflection. Ximena uses sarcasm to avoid admitting she's scared. Aiden uses dry, clipped responses to avoid admitting he's affected. When their laughter starts becoming shared rather than weaponized, you feel the relationship shifting. It's subtle, but it's there. And when the laughter stops, when the poisoning thread presses too hard, when the stakes rise, the absence of humor feels like a loss. That's smart writing. It makes you miss the banter, which makes you understand why the characters cling to it. Okay, let me lean into one more mini retelling, because there's a particular emotional texture the show nails in its tenser moments. Picture this. A late night, the house quieter than it should be, the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own thoughts. Aiden is pushing himself too hard. Because of course he is. Because if he stops moving he might have to feel. Ximena catches it. She doesn't explode. She doesn't dramatize. She just narrows her eyes, steps closer, and suddenly the air changes. She speaks with that calm doctor tone that is somehow scarier than yelling because it means she's serious. He tries to brush it off. He tries to control the narrative, and she, very simply, refuses. She says what she sees. She names the risk. And for a second, he looks at her like he's standing on the edge of a cliff and she's offering her hand. It's not a romantic cliff. It's a trust cliff. And he doesn't fully take her hand right away. That's the point. He hesitates. He fights it. He resists because resistance is his religion. But the moment lands because you can see the desire to surrender to keep battling with the fear of being hurt. That's the kind of tension that makes me keep watching. Not will they kiss, but will he let himself be helped? Now, the show also plays with the idea of public image. Because Aiden is a CEO and CEOs in dramas are basically walking PR machines. The fake marriage is, at least partly, a public-facing narrative. And the show understands how exhausting it is to live inside a narrative that isn't yours. Aiden has been doing that his whole life. Ximena is newly forced into it. So you get this dynamic where he's oddly good at performing the marriage and she's oddly bad at it. Not because she's awkward, but because she hates lying for social comfort. Watching her learn to weaponize that performance when necessary is fun. Watching him realize that performance without truth is hollow is less fun, more painful, but satisfying. And I think that's why the show's romance feels unexpected. It's not unexpected to us as genre viewers. It's unexpected to the characters. Ximena doesn't expect to care about him beyond the funds. Aiden doesn't expect to respect her beyond utility. Neither expects to find solace in the other's presence. So when it happens, it feels like an accident they keep trying to explain away. I also appreciate that the show doesn't make Ximena's dedication purely romantic. She's a doctor. She has a professional oath and ethical drive. Her desire to treat him is tied to who she is, not just who she loves. That keeps her from becoming a nursemaid love interest. It preserves her autonomy. And it makes the romance feel healthier, ironically, because it's not built on her abandoning herself for him. It's built on her being herself near him. Now, we should talk about the use her at first part, because this is where some viewers will decide whether they can tolerate Aiden. He does start off using her. He's not gentle about it. He's not warm. He's not fair. And if you have a low tolerance for cold male leads, you might struggle early on. But what made me stick with him is that the show doesn't frame his coldness as sexy by default. It frames it as a flaw. It shows consequences. It shows how isolating it is. And it lets Ximena push back. She doesn't swoon at cruelty. She doesn't romanticize neglect. She reacts like a real person with self-respect. That dynamic is essential because it stops the romance from becoming an apology tour for bad behavior. And to the show's credit, Aiden's growth isn't just he becomes nicer. It's that he becomes braver emotionally. He becomes more honest. He becomes more willing to take risks that aren't financial. That's a more interesting arc than Cold Man Warms Up. Also, the poisoning plot inherently makes him sympathetic without absolving him. It gives him vulnerability that isn't self-pity. It gives him a legitimate reason to be guarded. But it doesn't excuse him treating people like tools. It just explains why he does. Now, if you're listening and thinking, this sounds like a lot, yes, it is. But it's also somehow easy to watch. That's the paradox. It's emotionally led, but it's not exhausting. Because the show keeps giving you release valves. Humor, tenderness, small wins, little moments of connection that feel like sunlight through blinds. And when it gets sweet, it's not saccharine. It's grounded sweetness, the kind that comes from two people finally relaxing around each other. The kind where a simple gesture feels monumental because you know how hard it was for them to get there. There's a particular sweetness in watching Aiden, a man who is used to people orbiting him for benefit, start doing things for Ximena without making sure she notices. That's when you know he's gone. That's when you know he's not using anymore. He's investing. Emotionally, quietly, terrifyingly. And there is sweetness in watching Ximena, a woman who is used to fighting alone, start letting herself lean on someone without feeling like she's selling her soul. That's her growth. That's her learning that partnership isn't weakness. Okay, let's breathe, because we're about to get into the part of the drama where the stakes start tightening, and the romance starts getting tested in more serious ways. And I want to talk about how the show uses tension without derailing its own tone. Because this is the exact point where a lot of dramas panic. They think, okay, people are invested now, so let's manufacture pain. And then they throw in the loudest misunderstanding possible, crank the music to 11, and suddenly everybody is behaving like they've never met before. Miss Urologist and her CEO patient flirts with that cliff. Absolutely. But what I appreciated is that it mostly chooses a different kind of tension. It doesn't just test the couple with jealousy or random outside suitors. It tests them with the things that are already baked into who they are. Pride, control, secrets, health, money, professional ethics. The stuff that would actually make intimacy hard even if you weren't in a trope. And when the stakes tighten, you feel it in the way the show starts using space. Early on, the house is a comedic arena. Later, it becomes this fragile sanctuary that outside forces keep trying to breach. The camera starts peeking from door frames more. You get more scenes where a character is framed partially obscured, as if the story itself is saying, you don't get the full truth yet. There's a creeping sense that the same wealth and power that makes Aiden untouchable also makes him a target. That's such a delicious irony, and the drama leans into it without losing its romantic core. If you're wondering whether the poisoning thread becomes central or stays a subplot garnish, the answer is, it becomes an emotional accelerant. It's not just who is doing it, it's what does it do to a person to live with that kind of violation. Because chronic poisoning is, at heart, a prolonged invasion. It's your body being treated as someone else's property. And the show understands how that would warp your relationship with trust. Aiden's aloofness stops reading like a personality quirk and starts reading like a survival response. Now, I'm going to be careful here, because moderate spoilers means I can't start declaring exactly who did what in the endgame. But the show does move into that latent reveal energy where the air feels thinner, like every conversation has subtext, and every kindness might be a trap. That shift is tricky in a rom-com, because you can easily lose the playful tone and end up in tonal whiplash. This drama avoids the worst of that by keeping Ximena's voice consistent. Even when she's scared, she stays practical. Even when she's emotionally compromised, she keeps working. That consistency is what lets the show go darker without feeling like it changed genres out of nowhere. And here's where I want to drop a slightly surprising take. I don't actually think the most compelling villain in this story is whoever is behind the poisoning. The most compelling villain is the environment that made poisoning plausible. The culture of secrecy around powerful men's health. The way corporate ecosystems incentivize silence. The way Aiden's image is treated as a product that must be protected at all costs. Because even if you removed the poison from the story, that environment would still be toxic. The poison is just the literalization of it. Hold on to that thought, because it's what makes the romance feel like more than just a cute, fake marriage becomes real arc. When Ximena decides to dedicate herself to treating him, the drama could have made it a pure caretaking fantasy. But it doesn't. It gives her frustration. It gives her fear. It gives her moments of doubt where you can tell she's thinking, am I doing this because it's right? Or because I'm attached now? That internal conflict is so much more interesting than a saintly heroine who never wavers. And it's also more respectful to the reality of caring for someone with an ongoing condition. Caring is not a straight line. It's a loop. It's repetition. It's patience. And patience has a limit. Aiden's side of it is equally messy. Because the more she helps, the more he has to confront the fact that he needs someone. And he hates needing. He's built an entire life around not needing. Not emotionally, not physically, not publicly. So watching him slowly accept treatment isn't just a medical plot. It's his emotional arc in a lab coat. Each time he allows Ximena to do her job, he's allowing her into his vulnerability. Each time he tries to dismiss it, he's trying to slam the door on intimacy. And the show keeps asking, how do you build a relationship when one person is literally trying to survive and the other is trying to keep their own integrity intact in the middle of moral compromise. There's a moment later on where the contract aspect of their marriage starts to feel like the least important part of their bond. And that's when the story gets weirdly tender. Because the contract is, at first, this cage. It's caution adjacent. It's a set of terms that reduces a marriage to clauses. But over time, it also becomes a weird kind of safety structure. Not because contracts are romantic, but because it forces them to negotiate, to articulate boundaries, to define expectations, to talk even when they'd rather not. And yes, I realize how unhinged it sounds to say, this contract marriage taught them healthy communication. But the show actually does that. It uses the contract as a narrative tool to make the characters name what they want instead of pretending they don't want anything. This is where the writing earns its keep. Instead of relying entirely on misunderstandings, it builds conflict from competing priorities that are both valid. Ximena wants funding and professional progress, and she doesn't want to be swallowed by Aiden's world. Aiden wants control, privacy, and survival, and he doesn't want to be exposed as vulnerable. Those desires collide naturally. Nobody has to suddenly become an idiot for the plot to move. And that's also why their fights land. When they argue, it's not just noise. It's ideology. It's a clash between someone who believes in systems even while being crushed by them, and someone who believes only in personal control because systems have failed him. So every domestic argument has this bigger echo behind it. Okay, I promised myself I wouldn't do the thing where I turn this into a philosophy lecture, so let's get back into the juicy drama texture. Because some of the most memorable moments are not the big reveals. They're the small emotional eruptions that happen because the characters are finally too tired to keep performing. There's a late mid-stretch vibe where Aiden starts showing up for Ximena's work in subtle ways. Not in a grand billionaire donation with fireworks way, but in a he's paying attention way. The show is careful about this because it knows the danger. If Aiden just solves everything with money, Ximena's agency collapses. So what it does instead is show him learning to support rather than control. Learning to offer without demanding. Learning to ask her what she needs instead of assuming. And Ximena, in return, starts seeing him beyond the CEO costume. She sees that his aloofness is not arrogance alone, it's fear. And when she starts treating his fear with the same precision she treats his symptoms, the romance becomes something I didn't expect going in. Respectful. Like, genuinely respectful. If you've ever watched a drama where the couple is in love, but they don't actually seem to like each other as people, you know how rare that respect is. This show sells that they like each other's minds. They enjoy each other's presence even when they're annoyed. They're curious about each other. Curiosity is an underappreciated romance ingredient, and it's all over this drama. Now, let's talk about the humor again, because it changes as the relationship changes. Early humor is combat. Later humor becomes intimacy. Their jokes become inside jokes. Their banter becomes less about winning and more about connection. And the show's sound design reflects that. The comedic beats are less punctuated by overt musical cues later on. It trusts the actors. It lets the humor be quieter, more domestic, more we've lived together long enough to know exactly which button to press. There's a very specific kind of laugh you get when two characters who used to be formal start being casually rude to each other in a way that's affectionate. Like, I know you, and you can't scare me anymore. That's the laugh this drama earns in the later stretch. It's a sign that the power dynamic has shifted. And speaking of power dynamics, this is where the show deserves credit for keeping Ximena's spine intact. Even as she falls for him, she doesn't become submissive. She doesn't become impressed by his world. She doesn't shrink. The drama seems genuinely invested in her as a professional, not just as a love interest. That's why her research goal remains present. That's why she continues to make choices based on principle, not just romance. There's a rehook question sitting right here that kept me glued. At what point does love stop being a complication and start being the reason you survive? Because for Aiden, love is terrifying precisely because it's leverage someone could use against him. If he cares about her, she becomes a weakness. But the story gradually reframes that. Caring about her becomes a reason to be honest, a reason to seek treatment, a reason to confront the poisoning rather than silently endure. The weakness becomes motivation. And that's such a classic romantic transformation, but it's done here with enough restraint that it doesn't feel like a cliché. Now, I want to dig into one of the show's most effective tools, microacting. Those small facial movements that tell you the character is lying to themselves. Ximena gets these tiny, softening moments where she almost looks proud of him before she remembers she's supposed to be mad. Aiden gets these micro-flinches when Ximena gets too close to the truth, like his body is trying to retreat even when he stays still. The show knows to hold on those moments. It doesn't rush past them. It lets the audience do the work of feeling. And that's why the romance feels immersive. You're not just told they're falling in love. You watch it happen in the corners of their faces. Another craft element I want to shout out is how the show handles quiet. Silence is a weapon early on. It's avoidance. It's punishment. Later, silence becomes comfort. They sit together without needing to fill the air. That's such a simple shift, but it's one of the most intimate things a drama can show. Because it means the characters no longer experience each other as a threat. The cinematography supports that shift too. Early scenes use more separation in frames. Later scenes have more shared framing, more moments where they're both in focus, both present. Sometimes the camera will follow one character and then the other will enter the frame, and the composition subtly changes from solitary to shared. It's visual storytelling that doesn't scream at you. Now let's address something that some viewers will absolutely debate: Ximena's initial blackmail. Does the show redeem her? Does it excuse her? Does it punish her? The answer, to me, is complicated, and that's why it's interesting. I don't think the show fully punishes her in a moralistic way. It doesn't turn her into a martyr. It also doesn't turn the blackmail into a cute meet cute. It treats it as a foundational crack in their relationship that has to be reckoned with. The emotional consequences show up in trust issues, in arguments, in the way Aiden struggles to believe her motives even when she's doing something undeniably caring. And here's the contrarian part: I don't think Ximena needs to be punished by the narrative to be a worthwhile heroine. I think she needs to be accountable to the people affected by her choices, and the show does that through the relationship itself. The accountability is relational, not cosmic. It's not lightning from the sky. It's the slow work of rebuilding trust after you've violated it. That is, frankly, more adult than a lot of dramas manage. Aiden also has accountability. His initial desire to use her, his emotional coldness, his tendency to control situations rather than communicate, those are not treated as romantic virtues. They're treated as obstacles. And the show is patient with his growth. It doesn't cure him with one speech. He slips. He reverts. He tries to regain control. That's realistic. That's also why, when he does make a genuinely vulnerable choice, it feels significant. And yes, the romance becomes sweet. But the sweetness is complicated sweetness, like honey with a little smoke in it. It's not syrupy. It's earned. Now I want to relive one of the most vivid sequences in my head, because it's the kind of scene that made me pause the episode and just sit there. Again, I'm going impressionistic to avoid giving away too much, but you'll know the type of moment I mean. It's late. The lighting is low, not romantic candle low, but that practical nighttime dimness where shadows soften edges. Aiden is not doing well, physically or emotionally, and he's doing that thing where he tries to handle it alone because needing someone feels worse than pain. Ximena finds him anyway. She doesn't come in with dramatic music. She comes in with steadiness. She speaks quietly, asks a question he doesn't answer, and then there's this tiny beat where you can tell she's deciding whether to push or just be there. She chooses to be there. She sits, close enough that he can feel her presence, not so close that it feels like she's taking over. And the camera stays wide for a moment, letting you see how small they look in the room, how fragile their truce is. Then it slowly moves in, not to sensationalize, but to witness. Aiden's face does this subtle collapse, like a man exhaling after years. He doesn't suddenly become expressive. He just stops fighting for a second. And that pause, that surrender, is more romantic than any grand confession. That scene hit me because it's what I wish more dramas understood. Sometimes the most intimate thing you can do is not fix. It's witness. Ximena is a fixer by nature, a doctor, a researcher. And in that moment, she's just human. And speaking of being human, can we talk about how the show handles the CEO archetype without making him either a cartoon tyrant or a perfect prince? Aiden is flawed. Sometimes he's frustrating. Sometimes he's emotionally stingy. Sometimes you want to grab him by the shoulders and be like, "Sir, please, one honest sentence. I'm begging." But the show makes those flaws coherent. They come from fear and conditioning, not from random script convenience. His aloofness is also not portrayed as glamorous forever. The show gradually reveals how lonely it is, how empty it is, how it has cost him relationships, trust, and even health. That recontextualization is crucial. It turns the CEO trope from fantasy into critique, while still letting you enjoy the fantasy elements. That balance is hard to pull off. Meanwhile, Ximena is not written as a magical empathy machine. She has limits. She has frustration. She has ambition that could easily become obsession. And the show doesn't pretend that loving someone means you always know what to do. Sometimes she's wrong. Sometimes she pushes too hard. Sometimes she gets emotionally reactive. That's what makes her feel like a person. The supporting ecosystem around them, while not fully detailed in the premise we have, is implied in the way the story moves. There are pressures from Aiden's world that don't want him vulnerable, and pressures from Ximena's world that don't want her independent. The show plays those pressures like invisible hands on their shoulders. Even when a scene is just the two of them, you feel the weight of what they represent in their respective environments. And that's why the contract marriage trope works especially well here. It's not just we have to pretend for our families. It's we have to navigate being watched. Being watched by money, by institutions, by expectations, by whatever is lurking behind the poisoning. The marriage becomes camouflage. And camouflage is inherently tense because it can rip at any moment. If you're still thinking, okay, but is it actually romantic? Yes. It's romantic in a way that's rooted in care rather than constant swooning. It's romantic in the way they start protecting each other's dignity. Aiden learns not to use Ximena's feelings as leverage. Ximena learns not to use Aiden's vulnerability as a tool. Their love becomes, essentially, a mutual refusal to exploit each other anymore. And that, to me, is the real transformation. Not fake becomes real, but transaction becomes devotion. Now, let's talk about the show's music because it's doing subtle emotional guidance without becoming manipulative. The score is not constantly reminding you what to feel. It's more like a gentle hand on your back when the scene needs to dip in. The comedic cues are light, often minimal. The more serious cues come in with restraint, and that restraint matters because the story already has heightened elements. If the music overplayed the drama, it would tip into melodrama. Instead, it lets the actors carry the weight. Sound design is also used to create a sense of vulnerability. In some of the quiet domestic scenes, you can hear small ambient noises more clearly. The clink of a cup, the hum of a room, the soft rustle of clothing. That texture makes the intimacy feel real. Then, when tension rises, those ambient sounds can feel suddenly too loud, like the world is pressing in. It's subtle, but it contributes to the immersive feeling. Editing-wise, the show generally knows when to slow down. It doesn't always succeed. Sometimes it rushes through emotional beats to get to the next plot push, especially when the poisoning thread needs momentum. But when it slows down, It's gorgeous. It lets silence sit. It lets a glance linger. It trusts the audience to understand subtext. And subtext is this drama's love language. Half of what's happening between Ximena and Aiden is not spoken. It's implied. It's in the way one of them pauses before saying thank you. It's in the way Aiden's posture changes when Ximena enters a room. It's in the way Ximena's voice softens when she's worried but doesn't want him to feel weak. That's why the show rewards binge watching. You start noticing patterns. You start seeing how earlier scenes were foreshadowing later emotional shifts. Okay, here's a question that kept popping up for me and kept the tension alive. What happens when Ximena's professional mission and her personal attachment collide in an unavoidable way? Because she's treating him, and she's also falling for him. That's a messy overlap. And the show doesn't pretend it's not. It lets the mess exist. It lets the characters bump into the boundary lines. Ximena has to navigate not becoming emotionally reckless with medical decisions. Aiden has to navigate not using romance as a way to avoid hard truths about his health. The fact that the drama even acknowledges those risks, even lightly, makes it feel more grounded than most. Now, I do want to be honest about the places where the show's premise can create discomfort that not everyone will enjoy. If you are someone who cannot stand a romance starting from caution-adjacent circumstances, this will be a barrier. The show works hard to evolve beyond that start, but it can't erase its foundation. And the drama seems aware of that. It doesn't try to pretend the beginning was healthy. It builds toward health. That's different. But you have to be willing to sit with the initial ugliness long enough to see the growth. For me, what made it worth it was that the characters don't stay in that dynamic. They move, they change, they earn each other. And the tone keeps it from feeling oppressive. The humor, the warmth, the gradual mutual respect all help. Another place where viewers might split is the balance between the romance and the poisoning mystery. Some people will wish the thriller side was either more detailed or less present. Personally, I liked it as an undercurrent. It gave the romance stakes without turning the show into a full conspiracy labyrinth. But there were moments where I could feel the plot needing to nudge things along, and it got a little convenient. Not enough to break it, but enough that you notice the hand of the writer. And yet, the emotional logic stays intact. Even when plot mechanics are a little convenient, the characters' reactions tend to feel believable given who they are. Also, and I say this with love, there are moments where the show leans into the CEO aesthetics in a way that's almost funny. Like, sir, you do not need to be this sharply lit while having a vulnerable moment. Calm down. But at the same time, the heightened polish is part of the fantasy layer. The drama is letting you have your glossy romance visuals while also sneaking in emotional complexity. I can forgive a little extra sheen. Now, can we talk about the sweetness? Because the premise promises sweet and unexpected romance, and it delivers in ways that made me genuinely grin like an idiot. The sweetness comes from the couple learning each other's rhythms. It comes from them anticipating each other. It comes from the moment when Aiden, who used to treat the home like a hotel, starts behaving like it's actually a place where life happens. It comes from Ximena, who used to treat the relationship like a tactic, starting to treat it like something she wants to protect. And there's a specific kind of sweetness in watching someone like Aiden, so controlled, so measured, do something impulsive that reveals feeling. Not necessarily a grand gesture, but a moment of unfiltered reaction. Those moments are rare, and the show uses that rarity to its advantage. When he breaks his own rules, it matters. Likewise, Ximena's sweetness is not demure. It's not, I become softer and quieter. It's active. It's protective. It's stubborn care. It's her getting mad on his behalf, her advocating, her refusing to let him self-destruct. That's her love language. And it fits her character. Here's another contrarian-ish thought. I think some viewers will interpret Ximena's dedication to treating Aiden as her falling into the caretaker role. And they'll dislike it because it feels like the woman is once again doing emotional labor for the man. I get that critique. But I actually read her dedication differently. I read it as her asserting agency in a situation that started with caution. She chooses to treat him not because she's obligated, but because she decides her ethics and her feelings align. The key is choice. The show emphasizes her choice more than obligation. And that, to me, shifts the dynamic from woman sacrifices to woman decides. Still, the show could have gone further in showing her support network. One thing I missed was seeing more of Zimina's life outside Eden. We get her ambition, her work, her drive, but a fuller sense of her relationships, friends, colleagues, mentors, would have made her world feel even more textured. That's not a fatal flaw, but it's one of those imagine if enhancements that could have elevated the realism. Aiden's world, too, could have used more texture beyond corporate power. We feel the pressure, but sometimes the corporate side is a bit like a backdrop that exists to create tension rather than a fully lived-in environment. Again, genre constraints, but still. And yet, the show's focus is consistent. It's about these two people and what happens when they're forced to live in the same space, forced to confront each other, forced to see what they'd rather ignore. If you're the kind of viewer who likes newcomers-friendly drama, this one is actually accessible even with its medical thread. It doesn't drown you in jargon. It uses the medical element as emotional grounding rather than technical flexing. You don't have to be a doctor to understand what's at stake. You just have to understand what it feels like to be afraid of your own body or afraid of failing at something you care about. That's universal. Okay, let's talk about why the romance payoff works without giving away the final sequence details. The show spends a lot of time building the idea that their relationship is fake. Not just fake to others, fake to themselves. They keep telling themselves it's not real because if it's not real, it can't hurt. If it's not real, it can't be used. If it's not real, they can walk away with dignity. The payoff comes when the characters can no longer maintain that lie, when the lie becomes more painful than the truth. That's the turning point. And the show earns that by making the fake convenient early on. It gives them reasons to cling to it. Then it slowly removes those reasons and replaces them with something scarier, genuine attachment. And I'm not going to pretend I didn't get emotionally invested in a way that surprised me. There was a point near the later stretch where I realized I wasn't watching for plot anymore. I was watching for emotional safety. I wanted them to be okay. Not together as a trophy, but okay as people. I wanted Aiden to survive and trust. I wanted Zimina to succeed without compromising herself into dust. I wanted their love to be something that gave them strength rather than something that demanded sacrifice. And that's not a small thing for a drama that starts with blackmail to accomplish. One more thing about the show's humor, because I keep coming back to it. It's not just there to entertain. It's used as a diagnostic tool. When the humor is flowing, it means the characters are okay enough to play. When the humor dries up, you know something is wrong. The show uses comedic rhythm like a heartbeat monitor. That's clever. Also, I have to say, the show's title continuing to be kind of ridiculous, even when the story gets intense, is part of the charm. There were moments where I was watching a genuinely tense scene and my brain would remember the title and I'd be like, right, this is called Miss Urologist and her CEO patient. Like the drama itself is winking at you from the corner. It's a tonal anchor in a strange way, reminding you that even when things get serious, the story's core is still a romance with a playful spine. Now, because we're in the final part, I do eventually want to give you my overall verdict, who I think will love it, who I think will bounce off, and whether it's worth your time. But I'm not rushing that, because the show deserves a proper emotional landing, and so do we. Let's dig into Zimina's arc more deeply, because I think she's the real reason this drama has staying power. Zimina's ambition is not written as cute. It's written as consuming. She is driven by belief in her research and in her capacity to contribute. That's inspiring, but it's also dangerous. Because when you care that much, you can justify almost anything. The blackmail is a symptom of that. It's the moment where her ambition becomes sharp enough to cut. Over the course of the drama, the romance doesn't fix her ambition. It complicates it. It forces her to see that her work exists in a world of humans, not just data and funding. It forces her to confront that the means matter, that the people you step on to reach your goal are not abstract. And I loved that the show doesn't make her abandon the goal. It makes her refine it. It makes her choose a version of herself she can live with. That's character growth. Not, I stop wanting things, but I want things without becoming someone I hate. Aiden's arc mirrors that. He doesn't stop wanting control. He learns to loosen his grip where it's killing him. He learns that control can't protect you from everything, and that sometimes control is the problem. He learns that intimacy is a risk worth taking, because the alternative is a life that looks perfect and feels empty. And together, their arcs create this theme: healing is not just medical. It's relational. It's ethical. It's learning to live differently. The show's depiction of poisoning also functions as a metaphor for slow harm. The kind of harm that doesn't leave visible bruises. The kind of harm you learn to tolerate because it's gradual. That's true of illness, but it's also true of toxic environments. Aiden's life has been slowly harming him, physically and emotionally. Zimina's professional environment has been slowly harming her, pushing her toward desperation. Their meeting is the collision that makes those harms visible. And that's why their romance feels like a rebellion. Not a rebellion with banners, but a rebellion with choices. With honesty, with care, with refusing to treat each other as tools. Here's a rehook that I think captures the drama's emotional tension. Can love survive when it begins as leverage? Because that's the question the show keeps asking. And the answer it offers is not simplistic. It says, love can survive if the leverage is surrendered, if the manipulation is faced and dismantled, if the people involved decide to stop playing the game. That's the crux. The romance is not them winning, it's them quitting the war. Now, let's talk about the battle of wits part as storytelling structure. The drama uses their intellectual sparring as a way to avoid early emotional vulnerability. It's foreplay, yes, but it's also defense. If you can keep everything on the level of words and strategy, you don't have to admit you're hurt or scared. So the show spends time letting them be clever at each other. That builds attraction. But it also builds a habit of not being emotionally direct. Later, the tension comes from them having to unlearn that habit. There's a point where cleverness stops being cute and starts being a barrier. The show lets that happen. It lets the banter fail sometimes. It lets a joke land wrong. It lets a sarcastic line hit a nerve. Those are the moments where you see the relationship maturing. Because real intimacy is not just witty. It's honest. It's sometimes awkward. It's sometimes silent. And I appreciated that the drama doesn't treat maturity as boring. It makes maturity romantic. It makes a sincere moment feel like a triumph. On the visual side, the show continues to use contrast as emotional language. When Zimina is in her element, clinical spaces, research spaces, you see her posture straighten. The camera often frames her with purpose. When she's in Aiden's world, sleek, controlled, you see her energy disrupt the symmetry. It's almost like she brings chaos to his order, and over time, that chaos becomes life. The show also uses costuming in a way that tells you about character. Aiden's clothes are armor, structured, polished, predictable. Zimina's wardrobe tends to reflect movement and work. And as the relationship evolves, you get subtle shifts. Not in a makeover way, but in a these two are influencing each other way. He becomes slightly less rigid. She becomes slightly less guarded in private. Those tiny shifts matter. Editing rhythm also changes in the later stretch. It's less punchy in domestic scenes and more urgent in plot-driven scenes. That helps keep the tone balanced. You get calm and then you get pressure. Calm and pressure. Like breathing, like a heartbeat. It keeps you engaged without exhausting you. Now, I'm going to confess something slightly embarrassing. There were moments where I caught myself being protective of Ximena like she was my friend. Like, when Aiden would slip into old patterns of control, I'd be sitting there muttering, "Don't you dare." Which is always how I know a drama has gotten under my skin. When you stop evaluating characters like chess pieces and start reacting like you're in their living room, you're emotionally in. And that's another thing the show does well. It makes the living room feel real. The domestic sets feel lived in. Not overly perfect, not like a showroom. You can imagine these people actually existing there, having routines, leaving things in places, bumping into each other. That physical believability makes the emotional believability easier. Now, because the storyline includes the poisoning being the cause of his impotence, we should talk about how the show treats sexual vulnerability. It doesn't exploit it. It doesn't treat impotence as a joke that undermines his masculinity. It treats it as a symptom with emotional fallout. That's respectful. And it also allows the romance to be built on non-sexual intimacy early on. Touch that isn't sexual. Care that isn't erotic. Emotional connection that isn't driven by lust. And ironically, that makes the eventual romantic heat, when it emerges, feel more charged, because it's not rushed. It's not the first language of their intimacy. It's the later language after trust has been built. That's far more satisfying than a show that starts with immediate physical chemistry and then tries to retrofit emotional depth. Also, it's worth noting that the show's humor around bodily topics is handled with surprising maturity. It doesn't avoid the subject, but it doesn't cheapen it either. It acknowledges embarrassment without turning it into cruelty. That's a fine line, and the show mostly stays on the right side. Now, let's consider the unexpected part again. I think the unexpectedness is also in how gentle the drama becomes. It starts sharp. It starts like a duel. It starts with blackmail and manipulation. You expect it to stay spicy and combative. But over time, the drama's heart opens. It becomes softer. It becomes about caretaking and partnership and slow trust. That tonal evolution feels like watching winter thaw. And it's risky because some viewers come for the spice and want it to stay spice. But for me, the thaw is what made it memorable. There's a particular scene flavor in the later stretch where Aiden does something quietly considerate for Ximena's work. Not because it benefits him, but because it matters to her. And you can see her trying not to react. Trying not to let her face betray how much it means. And the camera catches it anyway. That's the show in a nutshell. Characters trying to hide their feelings while the camera lovingly exposes them. And that brings me to the direction. The director or directing team understands that romance is often about what's withheld. It's about near misses. It's about the moment before a touch. It's about the breath before a confession. This drama uses those moments well. It doesn't always need a big set piece. It can make you lean forward with a pause. Now, in terms of criticisms, I want to be fair. There are stretches where the plot can feel slightly repetitive. Aiden resists, Ximena pushes, Aiden relents, something external threatens, Aiden withdraws, Ximena persists. That pattern is emotionally coherent. But if you binge too fast, you might notice the loop. The show varies it with humor and with different emotional textures, but the loop exists. Also, the corporate side of the story, while thematically relevant, sometimes lacks specificity. You feel the threat, but you don't always feel the detailed mechanics of how corporate power operates. That's fine if you're watching for romance. But if you're watching for a tightly plotted thriller, you might wish for more. The show is not trying to be Succession. It's using corporate power as atmosphere and pressure. Similarly, the medical side is emotionally smart but not necessarily hyper-technical. It prioritizes character and theme over procedural detail. That's probably the right choice for this genre, but it's worth setting expectations. Another potential issue. The show occasionally leans into the fantasy that a single determined doctor can outmaneuver systemic obstacles through sheer will. Ximena is inspiring, but real systems are brutal. The show acknowledges that brutality, but still gives her more narrative power than reality might. Again, that's romance drama. We are here for catharsis, not a documentary. But it's part of the genre's bargain. Now, let's pivot into the emotional climax territory, still avoiding exact endgame specifics. The final stretch, from the perspective of structure, does the thing good romances do. It forces a choice. Not just do they love each other, but what kind of people will they be in love? Will they continue manipulating? Will they continue hiding? Will they continue using control as safety? Or will they build something honest? That's the real tension. And the show doesn't resolve it with a single speech. It resolves it through action, through what the characters choose to do when it costs them something. That cost is important. Romance without cost often feels hollow. Here, the characters pay. Not necessarily in a tragic way, but in a growth way. They give up certain defenses. They risk reputation. They risk being wrong. They risk being hurt. That's love. And when the show finally allows the relationship to become real, it doesn't feel like a switch flipping. It feels like inevitability. Like you watch them build a bridge plank by plank, and then suddenly you realize they're already standing on the other side. There is softness in those later moments that I found genuinely moving. And I'm not even someone who always cries at romance. I'm more of like a stare at the wall for 5 minutes afterward emotional processor. But there was a scene near the end where the tenderness felt so earned that my eyes did that annoying stingy thing. Not full tears, but that, oh, okay, you got me, burn. And what got me wasn't the romance in isolation. It was the implication that Aiden might finally be safe in his own body. That Ximena might finally be supported without having to compromise herself into a corner. That they might finally be able to exist without constant defense. That's why this drama is emotionally satisfying. It's not just a love story. It's a safety story. Now, let's talk about the audience. If you're a newcomer to dramas like this, the trope list might sound intimidating. Blackmail, contract marriage, CEO, medical mystery, poisoning, impotence as a plot element. That's a lot of ingredients. But the show mixes them in a way that's surprisingly smooth. It doesn't feel like it's throwing everything at you. It feels like it's building a world where those ingredients naturally intersect. If you're a seasoned fan of contract marriage stories, you'll recognize the bones, but you'll also notice the places where the show adds muscle. The medical angle isn't just novelty, it's thematic. The poisoning isn't just suspense, it's metaphor. The romance isn't just chemistry, it's ethics and care. If you're a critic-minded viewer, you'll probably have debates about the blackmail premise and the moral framing. You might argue that the show romanticized coercion even while critiquing it. You might wish it went harder in condemning certain behaviors. That's a valid conversation. For me, the show's strength is that it doesn't pretend the beginning is pure. It shows impurity and then shows growth. Whether that's enough depends on your tolerance. Let me drop one more self-aware moment, because I can't resist. There was a point where Aiden did one of those classic CEO, tries to be domestic and fails things, and I laughed out loud and then immediately felt weirdly proud of him, like he was a toddler putting on socks. Which is ridiculous. He's a grown man. But that's how effectively the show weaponizes vulnerability. It makes you root for him to do basic emotional tasks. It makes you celebrate the smallest progress. And that's both funny and kind of alarming if you think about it too hard. Now, we should talk about why the drama's title pairing, urologist and patient, is not just a gimmick, but a boundary question that the show keeps returning to. The romance is constantly negotiating the ethics of their connection. Even when the show is being playful, you feel that underlying tension. This began as doctor-patient adjacency, and it evolved into something else. That evolution can be complicated. The show handles it by emphasizing consent, choice, and mutual respect as the relationship matures. It doesn't treat medical authority as romantic power. It treats it as responsibility. Ximena doesn't own Aiden because she treats him. If anything, The show shows her resisting that kind of authority misuse. She is careful with him. She insists on truth. She insists on boundaries. She insists that he participate in his own survival rather than handing it all to her. That's important. It keeps the romance from becoming a savior narrative. Aiden, too, has to learn not to fetishize being cared for as a substitute for intimacy. There's a risk in stories like this that the vulnerable character becomes addicted to care and mistakes it for love. The show avoids that by making Aiden's feelings develop through respect and admiration for Ximena's mind, not just gratitude for her treatment. He doesn't fall for her because she fixes him. He falls for her because she challenges him, sees him, refuses to flatter him, and stays anyway. That's the kind of love that feels believable. Now, I want to talk about the show's emotional honesty because this is where it really won me over. A lot of dramas confuse intensity with sincerity. They give you loud confessions, dramatic confrontations, tears in the rain, and they call that deep. This drama, when it's at its best, goes quieter. It shows you sincerity in the moment someone chooses to tell the truth without being forced. It shows you intimacy in the moment someone says, "I'm scared," and the other person doesn't immediately try to fix it. They just listen. Those moments are what linger. There's also something deeply satisfying about watching a character like Aiden, who begins emotionally constipated, let's be honest, learn how to express care without trying to control the outcome. That's a hard lesson. It requires humility. It requires him to accept that he can't manage people's feelings like business assets. And when he starts learning that, the romance stops being a game and starts being a partnership. Ximena's side of that partnership is learning not to equate independence with isolation. She's been forced to be self-reliant. She's been rewarded for competence. But self-reliance can become a prison. Letting someone in feels risky. It feels like losing control. So her growth is subtle. She starts asking for help. She starts accepting support. She starts letting herself be held emotionally, not just physically. And that, to me, is the sweetest part. Okay, I think we're finally at the point where I can give you my overall stance clearly. I love this drama. Not it's perfect loved. Not it reinvented television loved. I loved it the way you love something that has a weird premise and a big heart and enough craft to make you forget you ever doubted it. I loved it because it made the contract marriage trope feel emotionally purposeful rather than purely mechanical. I loved it because it respected Ximena's ambition. I loved it because it gave Aiden vulnerability without turning him into either a joke or a tyrant. And I loved it because it made care feel romantic without making romance feel like a cure-all. Would I recommend it? Yes, with a few caveats. If you can't tolerate a romance that begins with manipulation, you might hate the early setup and never forgive it. And that's fair. If you need your leads to be emotionally healthy from the start, this is not that. These are two people with jagged edges doing damage before they learn to do better. But if you like slow-burn intimacy built through shared space, if you like banter that evolves into tenderness, if you like a heroine who is competent and morally complicated, if you like a male lead whose growth is about vulnerability rather than just becoming nicer, you're going to have a really good time with this. If you're new to dramas and you're looking for something that feels glossy but not hollow, this is a great entry point. It gives you tropes, but it also gives you character. It gives you romance, but it also gives you themes. It gives you comedy, but it doesn't insult your intelligence. And if you're a seasoned romance viewer, I think what will keep you invested is the way the show treats care as intimacy. There's something genuinely refreshing about a romance that is willing to make medical vulnerability part of the love story without making it cheap. My biggest criticisms, if I'm laying them out plainly, are that the plot mechanics around the external threats can sometimes feel a bit convenient, and the corporate world could use more texture. There's also a repetitive loop in the emotional push-pull that might stand out if you binge too fast. But those flaws didn't outweigh the emotional satisfaction for me. The show's strengths, chemistry, character consistency, tonal balance, microacting, and that slow trust build are strong enough to carry it. And honestly, the drama's biggest flex is that it made me care about two people learning how to stop using each other. That's not a small feat, that's a romance built on accountability, not just attraction. If you watched it and you felt conflicted about Zimina's initial blackmail, I'm right there with you. I don't think you're missing the point if that bothers you. I think the show wants that to bother you. It wants you to feel the discomfort so that the growth feels meaningful. The question isn't, was it okay? The question is, what do they do after? And what they do after is what makes the story worth watching. And if you watched it and you found Aiden too cold early on, I get that too. But I'd encourage you, if you can, to view his coldness as a starting point rather than a romantic ideal. The show is not celebrating his emotional repression. It's diagnosing it. And the cure is not Zimina's love alone. It's his willingness to change. That's why, by the end, the sweetness doesn't feel unearned. It feels like relief. So yeah, Miss Urologist and her CEO patient surprised me. It made me laugh more than I expected. It made me tense up in those quieter, scarier moments where health and trust collide. And it made me feel that warm, ridiculous affection you get when you watch two stubborn people finally stop fighting the thing they want. If you made it this far with me on Flick Flare, I appreciate you hanging out in my little emotional lab of overthinking romance dramas. Drop a comment with a moment that got you, whether it was a line, a look, a quiet scene you couldn't stop replaying in your head. And tell me if you were team, this is unethical, or team, let them cook, because I already know that debate is going to be heated. And if you're deciding whether to watch it, my honest closing thought is this. If you want a romance that believes care can be sexy, that respect can be thrilling, and that trust can be the real plot twist, this one is worth your time.